What if Stressed Out is Nico's flawed recollection from a previous cycle, trying to remember being Clancy as his mind is trying so hard to block it out.
I wish I found some better sounds.
On the 27th of April 2015, the band 21 Pilots put out the music video for their song Stressed Out, a single to their #1 charting album Blurryface. The lyrics are about pressure to grow, money, about work, stress, and about the nostalgia for a life you wish you could return to. The video features Tyler Joseph portraying a character called Blurryface. It uses this character to contrast the nostalgic and kind of carefree childhood innocence with the stress of being an adult. This character at the time was visually brought to life by Tyler donning black paint smeared on his neck and hands, and he was kind of thematically associated with the color red. After the release of the album Blurryface, over the course of the following, as of writing, next 4 albums, and with a ton of ARG-esque supplementary material, this character would be revealed to be called Nico, or in full, Nicholas Bourbaki. Over those next 3 albums we would see the band sort of develop that idea into a much more elaborate story, in which they create a whole world for Nico and other characters to inhabit. We are introduced to a character called Clancy, also portrayed by Tyler Joseph, who quickly becomes our protagonist and sort of our main character here. We then learn about the city of Dema, which is a circular city in a fictional continent known as Trench, which is controlled by a group called the Bishops. Nico is one of them. And we learn of Clancy trying to get out of Dema and the Bandidos, who are a rebel group living outside of Dema. They wear yellow. Bishops cannot see yellow. We learn of a dark and corrupting religion known as Vialism, which poses the destruction of the self to be the highest of all virtues, going as far as to worship the dead as long as they die by suicide. We learn of the bishops holding regular suicide rituals because they enable and sort of strengthen them, and thus, through that religion of Vialism, they gain powers, such as something they call seizing, for example, which lets you control the bodies of the dead, essentially. And spoilers, in more way than one, we go on to learn about cycles. Across the whole story, sort of themes repeat. Much of the music and the actual text here is concerned with the notion of being trapped in cycles of multiple sorts, events, escape, and capture, leaving Dema only to always end up returning. This, among other things, further parallels the ever-returning struggle with mental health issues, essentially. It's sort of baked into the story and into the music in like a million ways, basically, of the story, or at least the sort of more cinematic of the finale, ends up outright confirming the literal loop. Someone gets picked, here a Clancy. A Clancy is a role, that's something that you are, pushes back, then they end up becoming what they thought. They become a bishop. Clancy ends up becoming Nico. Now, with all that context in mind that we would gather over the years after its release, let's look back at Stressed Out of the album Blurryface, specifically the music video of it. Personally, my read has been that Blurryface is sort of proto-lore, as in not the canonical setup for what would end up being the lore, more like a first draft. Sort of setting up the themes for the story, but not part of it in the same way as the other later lore-specific albums. However, recently, after, to be honest, a few too many cocktails and finding some inspiration in my wife Kati saying it's Blurryface being nostalgic, I ended up working out kind of a specific reading of Stressed Out quite a bit. So by now I'm essentially full on posing. What if we don't interpret Stressed Out as proto-lore that ended up being retconned on the specific portrayal of Blurryface and how the word looks and etc. But instead we go ahead and do the opposite. Essentially we retcon the meaning of it to fit it better into the overall complete narrative. I propose that Stressed Out could be read as us seeing what it's like when the current version of Nico, the one we see act throughout the story, tries to remember being Clancy. Perhaps we could place it quite early in the lore, I guess, after Nico has only been a bishop for a short time. Perhaps it makes sense to assume Nico would probably remember less and less of the details about being Clancy, or rather, I imagined a few probably repressed and already mostly inaccessible scraps of his mind that he had left in the first place would probably fade almost entirely the longer he is a bishop. So I think it makes sense to assume that this would take place roughly around the time the lore picks up, when the new Clancy was essentially still a citizen of Dema. So for this I'm treating Stressed Out as essentially a sort of fever dream inside of Nico's head, trying to recall his origins, yanking scraps from like the last run when he was Clancy. The brain hates blanks, and so it always autofills and interprets what little it can still access from the past. Nico is a bishop. He only knows himself to be red. The bishops are symbolized by red. So that could be why Nico's head, in the memory that is stressed out, put red everywhere. Because Nico equals red. It sort of misfiles scenes. It possibly mashes up events and changing or removing context, maybe even adding or removing details or straight up making them up. Memories tend to recolor themselves. Our assumption of what is normal changes over time. I imagine this could be sort of a literal version of the same effect. For example, that door handshake. Kind of feels like the scene from Nico and the Niners, doesn't it? But I think it might also just be a rhyme, sort of across cycles, not the same event. Maybe his mind is trying to recall a moment that looked more similar to the one in Nico and the Niners, but failing to really reconstruct the context or the location. Or maybe it is closer to how it happened in this cycle. But since I think we have to assume that the cycles are more like a sort of thematic loop, but probably still vary a lot in how the details play out and how the events occur each time, there is a good few ways you could probably interpret details like that in this theory. Based on your own sort of underlying assumptions about how the details of how you interpret the lore, based on your own sort of underlying assumptions about the details of how exactly you interpret the lore and how much of it is to you more a symbolic thing or an actual story, a plot being told. Personally, I think we are seeing Nico reaching for something human in his head, but only getting glimpses, or like a sort of collection of inputs than a real memory. I don't think any of what we see in this video is literal events in the story. The childhood stuff reads less like facts, reads more like Nico being like, this is what a human life should feel like. I could for this imagine Nico sort of sitting in a dark chamber somewhere in Dema by candlelight, trying to maybe write a chronicle or a journal of some sort, trying to piece together something about his earliest days as a bishop, and then getting hit with this like horribly mangled, disjointed fever dream version of his subconscious mixing hallucinations and trying to fill in missing context with assumptions about what it might have been like to be Clancy, and trying to fill in missing context with assumptions of what it might have been like to be Clancy, while not really aware of what he is thinking about. Or realizing really that he was Clancy in a factual way. Sometimes a certain spell takes me back when I was young. I think this line could be Nico's mind, sort of echoing back remainders of Clancy, but they just aren't able to break through. If you want to go crazy with it, there are some specific details here that could match up and explain things in more interesting ways even. I have noticed a few more details that could play into the lore in interesting ways, and I think add to it. Let's take the tricycles, the only notable appearance of the color yellow in the video. I know this is kind of a stretch, but the tricycle seats are yellow. I know this is kind of a stretch, but the tricycle's seats are yellow, which means we, the audience, can see it. But if you imagine sitting on a tricycle, from the perspective of Blurryface right here, they are not in view. Bishops cannot see yellow. Josh here, or Torchbearer or whatever, being in all red, like themed, no, you know, Josh right here, or Torchbearer I suppose, in this lore kind of reading, being all red themed in the video could also be because he would mentally fill Torchbearer in as red by default, because he only knows himself as red. And think about it, he remembers Torchbearer or Josh or whatever being on his side, and he only knows himself to be red. So even when he tries to remember, the palette sort of autocorrects to red, maybe because he couldn't remember seeing yellow. In a similar way, I think that's why we see the vision of Nico in a similar way. I think that's why we see the version of Nico in his own memory, basically looking like Clancy, but still with the smearing, the hands, the neck, the smearing both symbolically, as in the hands, the neck, the smearing both symbolically and in the literal appearance, probably so inherent to Nico at the time of trying to remember this that he couldn't even remember or imagine himself ever having been without it. I think a good analogy here is how you will sometimes misremember a story happening in your current place of living, or I think a good analogy here is how you will sometimes misremember a story happening wherever you currently live, even if you lived somewhere else when it happened. Or personally, it's a common occurrence for me to remember my current partners that haven't been present for any given story in my life, even when it was long before I met them. It's kind of like that. Nico can't actually recall most of his former stuff at all, so those little scraps of what his subconscious holds on to are still mixed up with imagination and hallucination as he is trying to recall them. Another interpretation I thought of, and I can't quite shake this one, is the same way our Clancy in our cycle that we watch throughout the story wears red even while he is with the banditos. Maybe there's some variation to that in the between the cycles. I could imagine in the previous path of the cycle, the one that we are seeing recalled in Stressed Out in this theory, maybe in that cycle Torchbearer tried wearing red too, trying to sort of stay closer to Clancy and keep him aligned and mirror him. I don't know about that one, could be nothing. I think I might prefer the can't see yellow explanation ultimately. However, this could play nicely into the tragedy. Behind all of Torchbearer's story right here. However, this could play nicely into the tragedy behind Torchbearer's story here even more. Even him trying new things every cycle to end up keeping Clancy on the right path and still failing. I also think the line could here be read as a nod to Clancy. Haven't been his name before. It was Nico or Blurryface, right? I essentially here treat Stressed Out as Nico looking into a broken mirror. Sort of echoes of memories that aren't cohesive. A glimpse of the cycle's last iteration. Maybe a backstory to Nico before we get into how all of the lore ends up being basically another backstory for another Nico. I think of it as a useful retcon that sort of deepens the cycles and deepens the lore for me. Whether it's canon or not is not really important to me in using this interpretation. However, we have to acknowledge this is still a retcon. It's a fan theory, it's speculation, and honestly I'm fine with that. Blurryface I think really eventually comes down to being proto-lore. I believe Dema wasn't even fully written or conceived of yet. Blurryface was not Nico, the bishop, yet. He became that later. In the real world's timeline here, I acknowledge that. All of this, of course, is also based on a lot of sort of floating assumptions that my personal interpretation of the lore in general brings with it, really. I gather online that most people's view of the lore isn't really as time-based, like as in a literal sense this would imply, because I gather in most people's view of the lore it isn't really I gather in most people's view of the lore, time isn't really a relevant factor at all, or as much as for me, because in a literal sense, as this would imply, because I gather in most people's view of the lore, time really isn't as relevant. In a literal sense, as this would imply, because I gather most people as far as I can gather and see, in most people's view of the lore actually, time isn't really as relevant in a literal sense as this theory would imply, because I gather most people tend to see it more symbolically than I do, interpreting the lore heavier on the side of thematic throughline versus where I see it more as an actual story with word building and a literal chronology in a traditional sense, or at least that's the impression that I get from a lot of analysis and content about it that I see online out there. I am also fully aware that this is probably pretty far from authorial intent or whatever. I am not actually trying to argue that this is the true or correct interpretation of Stressed Out, but I am taking this as an opportunity to try to just basically get the best possible experience for myself when reading and interpreting the lore as a whole. Now that City Walls and Dragpath have apparently, concluded the lore, at least for now. If we read Stressed Out with the cycle in mind, I think we can just tell a better story here. Or really, we can at least enhance the explicit part of the story in an, I think, thematically appropriate way by re-examining the very beginning stages of it all. I think we can tell now, if we read Stressed Out this way and specifically, or in general, just with the cycle in mind, I think we can use it to tell a better story here. Or really, we can enhance the explicit part of the story in what I think to be a thematically appropriate way by just re-examining the very beginning stages of it all with everything in mind that we would later learn. I think at the very least it's a neat alternative reading for me to think about. And with that, That's about it. If you liked it and you have an opinion on what all I said here, feel free to leave a comment. Love to hear your thoughts on this, and aside from that, have a good night. And well, that's about my thoughts on it. If you have an opinion on what all I just said, then you can feel free to leave a comment. Aside from that, that's about it. See ya. Goodbye.